I wasn't just losing an asset. I was watching the foundation of my reality crumble, piece by calculated piece. I remember the exact weight of the pen in my hand, a heavy silver instrument Evelyn had given me for our second anniversary. It felt solid, permanent. That permanence was what I was signing away, the last piece of Vance Labs, the company I'd built from nothing. I was selling it, the initial IP and the team, to Garrett Thorne's colossal firm, Thorne Ventures. The offer was excellent, enough to set us up for life with a clear separation of assets. They took the current tech, I retained the future potential, the spin-offs, the next-gen patents. Evelyn, who was my CFO and my wife, assured me the deal was watertight. She handled the initial legal review, saying the terms were perfect. The separation of IP was crystal clear. I signed that contract on a Tuesday. I felt relief, a calm, deep exhale after a decade of relentless effort. I looked at Evelyn across the polished mahogany table. She gave me that proud, soft smile of hers, the one that always made me believe everything would be all right. A week later, the first wire hit. Massive, life-changing. I thought we were safe. The trouble started not with a tremor, but with a slight, persistent humidity in the air. Something you know is wrong before the storm breaks. 6 months later, I was consulting with a new client on the side, a small, ambitious venture capital fund. I mentioned an upcoming project, a proprietary algorithm I'd been working on post-sale. It was a clear derivative, but legally, unequivocally mine. Their lead counsel, a sharp woman named Kira, stopped me cold. She asked to see the original sale contract. I waved it off, telling her my lawyer, Leonard Hayes, Lenny, had vetted it years ago, but Evelyn had executed the final drafts. She insisted. Adrian, Kira said, looking up from the pages, her expression flat, professional. There's a problem, a big one. She didn't mean. A typo. She pointed to a single sentence, buried deep in section 4.3 under future derivative works. It wasn't the sentence itself, but the lack of a necessary clarifying modifier. It read, Vance Labs assigns all improvements to the core technology to purchaser. What Evelyn and the first legal team had agreed upon was that the assignment only applied to improvements created during the transition period. But without that qualifier, the contract technically claimed all improvements indefinitely. Any lawyer should have caught it. Any CFO should have insisted on the clarification. I felt a cold pressure behind my eyes. I was exposed. I called Lenny immediately. I needed him to fix this administrative oversight. He was old school, meticulous. I sent him the final draft. He didn't call back for a full day. When he finally did, his voice was tight. Adrian, this isn't an oversight. This is a targeted strike. I maintained my composure. Lenny, don't be dramatic. It's a missing clause. We send a clarification addendum. Thorne Ventures won't risk a lawsuit over semantics. They won't need to, he stated, and the words hung in the air like dust. The contract is built around this fatal flaw. It's not just the missing qualifier. Look at Section 6, the termination clause. Evelyn filed it as voluntary dissolution of partnership assets, not a standard corporate sale. The difference, he explained, was catastrophic. By filing it as a dissolution of partnership assets, it fundamentally redefined my relationship with the company's IP. It stripped away a layer of protection that a standard corporate sale agreement would have provided. It meant that in the eyes of the court, the IP was simply being reallocated, not sold and separated. It was a sophisticated, deliberate legal maneuver designed to fail in my favor later. It was Evelyn's signature on that section. She was the only one who had the authority to file it that way. The air between Evelyn and me shifted, becoming glacial. I approached her, calm, controlled. I presented the document, circled in red. I watched her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp, didn't apologize, didn't even look guilty. She just looked tired. It was the best advice at the time, Adrian, she said, her voice flat. The tax structure was advantageous. You're overreacting. Overreacting. I kept my voice steady, professional. Evelyn, this error gives Thorne Ventures a legitimate claim to every innovation I develop from now on. They could invalidate my next 2 years of work. This isn't advantageous, it's destructive. She dismissed it, changing the subject to a renovation we were planning. The evasion was a new, sharp pain, then the final, immediate blow. 3 days later, I received the certified letter. Evelyn was filing for divorce. The grounds were vague, irreconcilable differences. The settlement demand, however, was shockingly specific and massive. She wasn't just asking for half of the initial sale money. The money we'd already agreed was joint property. She was asking for a percentage of the future value of all IP derived from Vance Labs, claiming joint intellectual contribution. She was using the very flaw she'd created to demand a cut of the IP she was simultaneously trying to hand over to Thorne. I sat in Lenny's office, the divorce petition on his desk next to the original contract. The betrayal was no longer professional, it was personal, intimate. She's leveraging the contract against you, Lenny summarized. If you fight the divorce, she threatens to validate the flawed contract, which cripples your future earnings. If you settle the IP claims in the divorce, you concede ownership, and she still walks away with half of what the IP should be worth, while Thorne gets the whole pie later. It was brilliant in its cruelty. A zero-sum game engineered to take everything. I focused. We fight both, the divorce and the IP assignment. Where is the weakness? In her case, Lenny, she was the CFO. She owed a fiduciary duty to the company and by extension to me. Her actions were either grossly negligent or deliberately fraudulent. Lenny leaned back, his eyes narrowed. That's the card we play, Adrian. We depose her. We show negligence and we try to get the contract voided, which nullifies her claim to the future IP. The deposition was brutal. Evelyn was cold, composed, and coached perfectly. Every question about the contract's flawed language was met with, "I relied on the best counsel available," or "that was the mutually agreed-upon tax structure at the time." Stoicism met stoicism, but when Lenny pressed her on her financial actions after the sale, things got interesting. He presented records of her withdrawing funds from the joint investment accounts, not just half but nearly 70%, in the 6 months following the sale. "Where did these funds go, Ms. Vance?" Lenny asked, his voice low. "They were transferred to a private managed account," she responded, her eyes flicking to her lawyer. "And who manages that account?" She hesitated. "That is privileged financial information not relevant to this IP dispute." The opposing counsel objected immediately, but the judge overruled him. She inhaled slowly. "Garrett Thorne's private wealth management firm manages it." The courtroom went silent. Garrett Thorne, my rival. The man whose company stood to gain millions from the contract she'd crippled. The connection was clear, but the intent was still blurry. The realization that my wife, the woman I shared a bed with, was in business with my financial enemy was the first deep cut. But it wasn't the bottom. The bottom was a calculated series of maneuvers that Lenny discovered while digging through her email server, a server she had foolishly configured on an old, insecure cloud service years ago. It started with identity theft. It wasn't stealing my wallet, it was stealing my history. Evelyn had created a ghost LLC, a shell company named Apex Synergy, months before the sale to Thorne Ventures. She used my background, my credit profile, and the social security number of a dormant business entity I'd once owned to establish its legitimacy. Apex Synergy, Lenny said, showing me the documents. "It's listed as a consulting and intellectual property acquisition firm. And look at the founding date, Adrian, 4 months before the Thorne sale." The LLC had 2 purposes. First, to launder the extra funds she'd withdrawn from our joint accounts. Second, and this was the real venom, it was the recipient of a secondary, secret agreement. In the contract with Thorne Ventures, the flawed one Evelyn had drafted, there was a sub-clause, a nominal $1 option for Thorne Ventures to purchase any IP previously acquired by any consulting entity affiliated with the original seller, within 5 years. Evelyn, through Apex Synergy, had essentially taken pieces of my developing IP, the very ideas she was arguing for in the divorce, and sold them to her shell company for minimal value. She could then sell them to Thorne later, outside the scope of the divorce settlement, essentially cutting me out entirely. The escalation continued into the courtroom. The case was now a complex web of corporate fraud, IP theft, and divorce. We were in the trial phase. Evelyn was called to the stand. This was the moment of the dual betrayal. Her lawyer, a slick, aggressive man named Mr. Harrington, stood up and announced a procedural change. "Your Honor, due to the nature of Ms. Vance's subsequent consulting work, we are entering a new piece of evidence." He presented a document. It was a formal consultancy agreement. "Ms. Vance," Harrington began, "in your capacity as a consultant, you were recently asked to provide expert analysis on the market value of the core technology sold by Vance Labs to Thorne Ventures, were you not?" Evelyn nodded calm. "Yes." "And who "Your services for this expert opinion." "Garrett Thorne's legal team, Your Honor." The air left my lungs in a rush, but I maintained my composure, gripping the edge of the counsel table. She wasn't just working for Thorne, she was an expert witness for the opposing side in a case directly tied to the assets she was trying to claim in our divorce. Lenny stood up, his face thunderous. "Your Honor, the integrity of this entire proceeding has been compromised. Ms. Vance cannot claim a joint marital interest in the future IP while simultaneously being paid by the rival company who is claiming sole ownership of that same IP. This is collusion, a clear conflict of interest, and grounds for sanctions." The judge called a recess. Lenny was elated. The conflict was finally out in the open. The second deep cut came from a source I never expected. Garrett Thorne himself. During the recess, Lenny managed to subpoena Thorne for cross-examination. Thorne was arrogant, dismissive, but Lenny was relentless. He pressed Thorne on the Apex Synergy deal, the IP loophole, and the sudden hiring of Evelyn as an expert witness. Thorne just shrugged, playing dumb. We acquire IP, we hire the best talent, that's business. Lenny then brought up a detail from the initial 25% of the story, the voluntary dissolution of partnership assets filing. Mr. Thorne? Lenny asked, holding up the document. This filing signed by Ms. Vance was unusual for a corporate acquisition of this size. Did you or anyone at Thorne Ventures recommend this specific legal maneuver to Ms. Vance? Thorne smirked. Counsel, we don't advise the sellers on their internal filing structures. Then who did? Lenny insisted. This filing provided the exact legal vulnerability your company is now exploiting. Who created that vulnerability? Thorne paused, and for the first time his mask slipped. He looked genuinely annoyed. He was cornered. It was a suggestion, I suppose. Thorne finally spat out his tone venomous. Ms. Vance approached us with a preliminary concept years ago, before the company even incorporated. She asked what the cleanest way to transfer IP later would be if the opportunity arose. We gave her the technical framework. She executed the rest. Before the company incorporated, Lenny's voice was lethal. Mr. Thorne, when did Vance Labs incorporate? 5 years ago. And when did you and Ms. Vance first discuss this technical framework for asset dissolution? Thorne hesitated, looking down. Around 6 years ago, I believe. 6 years ago. Evelyn and I had been married for 2 years at that point. I had known Thorne socially from industry events, but Evelyn had always insisted she didn't know him well. I looked at Evelyn across the court. Her composure finally broke. Her face was a mask of terror. The judge asked for clarification. Mr. Thorne, are you stating that the asset dissolution strategy that now forms the basis of this IP claim was discussed between you and Ms. Vance before the formation of the company in question? Yes, Your Honor, Thorne conceded, his voice low and defeated. This wasn't just a corporate betrayal. This was the ultimate realization of the fatal flaw. The marriage itself was the setup. The years of building Vance Labs, the nights I spent coding, the sacrifices, the love. It was all part of a long-con strategy to build an asset, have her legally manage the sale to her co-conspirator, Thorne, and then exploit the resulting chaos for a massive payday. Lenny used that revelation to decimate their case. The court immediately questioned the marital contract itself, given the evidence of a premeditated financial scheme. The final quarter of the story became about the cleanup. First, the divorce. Based on the evidence of premeditated fraud and the deliberate breach of fiduciary duty to the company, Vance Labs, and to me, as a partner and husband, the judge not only denied Evelyn's massive settlement claims, but also ordered a full investigation into her assets and the Apex Synergy LLC. The marriage was annulled on grounds of fraud, wiping out her claims to marital property. Second, the IP contract. The initial sale contract to Thorne Ventures was ultimately voided. The court ruled that the contract was predicated on a fraudulent internal filing, the voluntary dissolution of partnership assets, which was clearly a tactic of collusion between Evelyn and Thorne, rendering the entire document unenforceable. Thorne had to forfeit the initial payment, and Vance Labs, now solely under my control, reacquired all IP. Third, the fallout. Evelyn and Thorne were slapped with civil fraud lawsuits. The evidence of identity theft related to the Ghost LLC also led to a criminal investigation. I never saw Evelyn again after that final court date. I didn't cheer. I didn't celebrate. The stoicism I maintained in court was not a performance, it was a shell. I walked out of that courtroom financially whole but spiritually ruined. The victory tasted like dust. The pen she had given me for our anniversary, I still have it. It sits in a safe deposit box, a reminder that the object you believe is solid and permanent can sometimes be the very instrument of your undoing. The physical and emotional weight of that simple, silver pen still reminds me that the most dangerous contract is the one you sign with your heart, thinking it's sealed. I am free now, free to build again. But the trust, that part is gone forever. And that, I realize now, was the only thing Evelyn and Thorne truly managed to steal.